I was running. Running fast. Running for my life. A gunshot rang behind me. I flinched at the sound, nearly tripping. The skirt I was wearing got caught in my legs. You must be wondering how I got here. Why was I running? While wearing a Japanese girl's high school outfit, no less. Well, it's a long story. One that I'll tell you now. It all started when I went to visit my grandpa. I noticed that he was acting weird the first day I'd arrived. Oddly quiet. Sometimes he'd open his mouth and then close it. I tried to ignore it, but once dinner came, I decided to ask him what was wrong. He'd sighed. He crossed the room and picked up a chest. He placed it onto the table.
I'm getting old. This is now yours as my heir.
I opened the chest. Inside was a gleaming ruby. This must be worth thousands. My grandpa didn't reply, and when I went to tell him goodbye in the morning, he'd already left the house. I checked the price of the ruby when I came back home. The internet said it was worth $80 million. I nearly foamed at the mouth. My family was in financial trouble. This was more than enough money to get us back afloat. When I told my parents, their eyes were gleaming. We drove to a jewelry store the next day. My mom stopped us halfway when she noticed that she'd forgotten her purse. We go back to the house, only to find it surrounded by a group of men. We decided to drive around the neighborhood until they leave. After 2 hours, we start to see smoke near where our house is. We drive to it and see that it's on fire. "We need to call 911, my mom cried.
No, something's wrong,
my dad argued. He pointed at the men who now have noticed us. They got into their truck.
We need to leave now.
We started driving away. Their truck followed us. My dad looped us around and then onto the freeway. The truck was in the distance. We got off and went into town. We drove around many corners trying to lose them. The truck didn't falter. "Go into the tunnel," I told my dad.
"But that's leaving town,"
my dad said. "Exactly." We went into the tunnel and then immediately got onto the freeway. "Now take the exit." I quickly looked behind us. The truck hadn't caught up. We found a hotel in a different town and hid our car in an underground parking lot. I call my grandpa in the hotel room. "What kind of ruby did you give me?"
"I'm sorry I did this to you,"
he apologized.
"You need to come to Japan. I'll explain everything here. It's unsafe to talk about this over the phone."
"What about the people chasing us?" I asked.
"I'll hook you up with a guy. He can give you fake passports and a safe trip."
I didn't argue and followed my grandpa's instructions. A strange man picked us up at the hotel and brought us to a small airport. We were given a personal plane to fly. "If we weren't being chased, this is almost like first class," I muttered. How rich was my grandpa? I'd always thought he'd had a decent job in life. Now it seemed like that was anything but true. We arrived in Tokyo, Japan, late at night. I called my grandpa to find out he's in Yamaguchi.
"Wait for me there,"
he told me. He'd come the next day. We stayed at the hotel. The next day, someone knocked at our door. I opened it, thinking it was my grandpa. It wasn't. It was a man in black I didn't recognize.
"Where's the ruby?"
he demanded. I booked it and ran. My parents were eating breakfast in the banquet room, but I was the one with the ruby. I decided to go into the street. The man was still chasing me. I pushed through the crowd, trying to lose him. I noticed a train station and sprinted down the steps. I jumped over the gates and boarded the nearest train. I saw the man watching me through the window as the train started moving. The train stopped at Soka. I found a small cafe and called my grandpa inside. He'd meet me there. He arrived in an hour, looking tired and as if he'd aged years.
"I found a seller," he told me. "We just need to sell that ruby and we'll be free."
"What did you get me into?" I asked. He sighed.
"I stole that ruby 5 years ago for your grandma. I couldn't afford it back then. Apparently it's a cursed ruby that is wanted in the black market here. Those men have been chasing me for years. I thought I could divert them by giving it to you."
"So they started chasing me," I said bitterly.
"I thought they'd give up once they knew I didn't have it." He shook his head. "I'm sorry. Let's go to that cellar.
We found the cellar in a back alley. He covered his face with a mask and glasses.
You have the ruby? We do,
my grandpa said. I'd never held so much cash in my life. The seller bowed at us and then disappeared into the alley. My grandpa and I went to his hotel room. He divided the cash and handed me a couple thousand.
Use this money to buy you and your parents new identities. I'll give you the guy's name.
What about the rest of the money? I asked. My grandpa smiled.
It'll go into your new identities account once you have a new name. I said you were my heir. This is your money.
You don't want any?
I'm too old to need all that money,
he told me. He grinned.
Buy you and your parents a nice car.
I will, I smiled back.
I first started feeling the effects in high school. They were mild with only the odd headache or dizziness, but eventually my symptoms would ramp up. I was born in Chicago and was raised there up until recently. My mother, who sadly passed away 4 years ago, was a police officer, and my dad was a chemist. We weren't super rich, but being an only child, I was always treated to expensive things, such as phones and clothes, etc. That all changed on the 20th of July, 2016. From what I was told, it was a routine stop. The car had been speeding, and my mom turned on her siren and tried to get the car to pull over. After 4 to 5 minutes of the speeding vehicle evading, the police officer controlling the car drove up beside the criminal. The speeder then spun the wheel to the left, ramming the cop car off the road into a tree. My mom died on impact. The months after were a blur. We lost the house and a lot of the luxuries we once had. My dad was forced to double his hours at the pharmacy, and most of his free time he spent holed up in the basement. I spent a few months away from school directly after the incident, but other than that, I knew I had to just keep moving forward with school and my other responsibilities. My dad used to say, if you stop paddling, you drown. I kept those words on repeat in my head in the months following the crash. Early 2017 was when I first noticed something was up. My dad had a gleam in his eye again, as if he was finally getting over the loss of his wife. For the first time in a while, he seemed motivated. He still spent most of his time in the basement. However, he started leaving more often and making me smoothies and cooking dinner for us to sit and eat together. Life seemed to be going great for a while. In March of the same year, I was in class when I started to feel super ill. The room started spinning and my vision was tinted a greenish color. Luckily, my teacher saw how sick I looked and called my dad to pick me up. On the drive home, he quizzed me in depth about how I was feeling, every symptom, what time it started, whether I felt this or that. At the time, I put it down to him being concerned. We got home and my symptoms refused to subside. I asked my dad if we could go to the hospital, but he told me I would sleep it off. August came around. One night, my dad and I were watching TV with some ice cream when my mouth suddenly went numb. I was trying to tell my dad, but I could hardly move my mouth. The numbness then spread around my body, and I was slumped on the couch paralyzed. The last thing I remember was my dad leaving the room. I woke up the next day in my bed. I tried to tell my dad what happened, but he laughed, telling me it was probably sleep paralysis. It seemed plausible at the time. More events similar to these happened in the months following, varying from me going temporarily blind to my lips changing color. That brings us to 3 months ago, when I finally uncovered the truth. It was a stormy Friday night. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, I heard a loud bang. I left my room to try and find my dad, believing we were getting robbed. He wasn't in his room, so I snuck downstairs to look around. I remember a bluish light emanating from the basement door, as well as hearing other sounds coming from the inside. My dad told me to not go into the basement. I was reminded of this rule every time he left for work in the morning. I had always stayed out of there, as I had no real interest in the dark, cobweb-filled cellar. But now was different. I felt for the first time the urge to break my dad's golden rule. I slowly opened the door. It was a miracle that it didn't creak. Venturing unsteadily further downwards, the light got brighter and the sounds less muffled. I heard my dad muttering to himself, accompanied by the same loud banging I had heard before. I peered round the corner. There was a white desk cluttered with loose bits of paper and a dozen different prescription drugs. My dad had stripped down to his vest and jogging bottoms. He was hammering away at a strange-looking machine with blinking red lights on the front of it. I sheepishly called my dad's name. He froze in position and without turning around told me to go to bed. I asked him if he was okay and walked toward the desk and was horrified by what I saw. It was a list labeled Notes on Daughter. It detailed all of the strange symptoms I had been feeling, including the numbness and blindness. Next to this was the drug or mixture of drugs he had given me. I started backing away, scared for my life. He told me that he would never try to hurt me, but I had seen the truth. Then he threw a strange liquid at me that splashed my arm. It instantly went numb and it fell to my side. He began getting more of the strange mixture when I bolted up the cellar stairs. He chased me, but I waited at the entrance and pushed him over. The liquid drenched him and he fell motionless onto the floor. I sprinted out the house and reported him to the police. When they got there, he was already gone.